My name is Ian Du Bois. I'm a board member, and in case you can't place my accent, I'm from Northern Ireland. Before I introduce the speakers, I have to remind you to use the Twitter hashtag Humanist 2023, all one word with a capital H. The title for this session is Inequality, the Enemy Between Us. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson. Kate is Professor of Epidemiology, Fellow of the Royal Society, Fellow of the British Academy of Sciences, Social Sciences, and was awarded the OBE in the New Year's Honours List in 2023, before the honours list got a little murky. And Richard is Emeritus Professor of Social Epidemiology at Nottingham Medical School and Honorary Professor at UCL and York. They co-authored one of the most important books in the past 20 years, in my opinion. I worked in the health service, and this was really a seminal work, The Spirit Level, and followed it up with what Kate described as their difficult second album, The Inner Level, in 2019. Please welcome Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson.
Thank you, Ian. It's lovely to be here. I'm going to speak first, and then Kate will take over. We'll try and leave some time for questions. Kate said I should explain that we're married, so we feel free to interrupt each other, which we wouldn't otherwise. I regard myself as a sort of informal, unofficial humanist. About 60 years ago, I abandoned my Quaker upbringing, and I think our work actually has a lot to do with an evolved human morality of how to live together. And I think some of that is behind what we're going to tell you about the effects of inequality. Kate's going to talk mainly about how it relates to, inequality relates to problems of climate change. I'm going to talk about some of the factors, some of the processes which lead to endless different social problems, and also a psychological deterioration in psychological well-being in the population. Often when people talk about health and well-being, mental health in particular, the focus is entirely individual. This slide is meant to show you that there are things which can make mental health and well-being worse for all of us, the whole population. So, if you wanted to know who fell, you'd look at individual differences, who fell as they went over the hurdles. If you wanted to know what proportion fell, what proportion had poor mental health or whatever, you'd look at the height of the hurdles. So we're really talking about the height of the hurdles, the kind of social environment that makes life more difficult for all of us, affecting our interaction. I think people have a very naive view of inequality. They think it only matters if it creates poverty or something like that. I want you to think about it as a social relationship. A social relationship because it puts us all in a sort of pecking order. The people at the top of the social hierarchy, the richest, who often believe they're really superior to the rest of us, and read the social hierarchy as if it was a reflection of innate ability, and have prejudices such as the poor are poor because they're stupid or whatever, and the rich are brilliant. Inequality emphasizes all those sorts of views about superiority and inferiority. It makes class and status differences more important. It changes the relationships between us. And basically, we're going to be taking you through some of that sort of stuff. When I said most people think it's just about poverty, that's why inequality matters, I want to read you a few lines from a study which looked at the experience of poverty in both rich and poor countries. I'm just going to read you a paragraph or two from a study which interviewed people living in poverty, defined in quite different ways in different societies, and obviously the material living standards of people in poverty was much lower in, I've got, that'll still do, will it? I think I'm all right. You can still hear me. So it interviewed people in poverty in Uganda, India, China, Pakistan, Korea, the United Kingdom and Norway. And in some of those countries, poverty might have meant living as the people on the right, in shacks with no sewerage or water supplies or whatever, whereas in Norway, poverty might be living in a 2 or 3 bedroom flat with central heating and a lot of the modern electronics. So totally different material circumstances. But what this study showed was the experience of poverty, despite those differences, was very similar. So the study said respondents universally despised poverty and frequently despised themselves for being poor. Parents were often despised by their children, women despised their menfolk, and some men were reported to take out their self-loathing on their partners and children. Despite generally believing that they had done their best against all odds, they mostly considered that they had both failed themselves by being poor and others saw them as failures. This internalization of shame was further externally reinforced in the family, the workplace, and in their dealings with officials. Even children couldn't escape this shaming, for with the possible exception of Pakistan, school was an engine of social grading, a place of humiliation for those without the possessions that guaranteed social acceptance. So think of poverty as meaning something really powerful in terms of social relations, how you're seen, being regarded as inferior. And actually, we all know this. We all know feelings of inferiority in relation to people who are further up the social hierarchy and so on. So I don't think anyone has any trouble understanding this. This graph I was pleased to find on Google Images, where if you're preparing any lecture, that's where you go. But it explains about 40 years of my work. I still haven't been able to simplify it as excellently as this, but people have paid my salary to produce what's behind this graph. So basically, with bigger income differences between rich and poor in our societies, a huge increase in a whole range of health and social problems. And I'm going to take you through some of those. First, this index, i.e. combination of different problems for different societies. We look just at the rich, developed market economies where there is good internationally comparable data on all those things you see in the column on the left. Life expectancy, children's maths and literacy scores, infant mortality rates, homicide rates, imprisonment, teenage births, measures of trust, obesity, mental illness, which in the standard psychiatric classification includes drug and alcohol addiction, and also some figures on social mobility. And countries high up on this are doing worse. High scores are worse on all those sort of things. They're all weighted equally, where something is like life expectancy to have a higher life expectancy is good. We've reversed scored it. So basically what you're seeing here is that, yes, that button, US, no.
Not that button.
My fingers are too big. I was called Hands at school for that reason. USA at top right, the most unequal of these countries, with worst performance on all those kind of outcomes, followed by Portugal. That was its position when we put this data together. It's improved, reduced its income differences a bit since then. And on UK comes next, doing pretty badly. And at the other end, the Scandinavian countries and Japan, all doing well. Low homicide rates, high life expectancy, kids doing well at school, people trusting each other more, low levels of obesity, and so on. We were worried when we were writing that people would think that we'd just chosen problems that suited our argument rather than actually finding data where there was internationally comparable data from official international organizations. So we also looked at an index that we had no hand in compiling. This index of child well-being, UNICEF index, made to measure child well-being in rich countries. And it includes just about everything you can think of. So whether kids have books at home, whether they can talk to their parents, whether there's bullying in schools, all that goes into the UNICEF index of child well-being. In this one, high scores are good. So instead of sloping up, as in the last graph, it slopes down. More unequal countries on the right doing badly. The USA, Portugal, exactly, let's see if I can press one button at a time. USA, Portugal, UK, and then the Scandinavian countries and Japan doing well at the other end. So exactly the same picture on a totally different index. And even our recent experience of COVID, quite striking effects of being a more unequal country. There are now at least 6, probably 8 papers in the peer-reviewed journals showing that the experience of COVID was worse in the more unequal societies. There have now been a number of papers looking at other outcomes. This is a measure that psychologists have sometimes used of what they call civic honesty. You know, the wallets are left around, apparently by mistake, and they see whether they're returned. I suppose they all have people's supposed owner's address in. And what this shows is you're much more likely to get your wallet returned if you've dropped it somewhere, if you live in a more equal society. In the more unequal ones in this, only about 15 or 20% of the lost wallets come back. In the more equal countries, it's 80%. Huge differences in what they call civic honesty. This is school bullying. Again, huge differences. It's the proportion of 11-year-olds who bullied others 2 or more times each month. And at the bottom left, you see that it's about, 2 or 3% in the more equal countries of 11-year-olds who bullied others, whereas up at the top on the right, the more unequal countries, it's nearly 20%. So huge differences in these kinds of outcomes that seem to be closely related to how unequal or equal a country is in terms of its income differences. I wish we'd had good internationally comparable data on wealth inequality. I have seen one paper now using the data that has become available, and it looks rather similar. Ideally, I think it would have been nice if we could have combined income inequality and wealth inequality. I'm now going to just give you what I think is a picture of the damage, probably the most fundamental effect, the damage that inequality does to social relations between us. There are now a number of papers. This is a graph we put together for the data, the societies we were looking at. And you can see that involvement in community life, civic participation, whether people belong to voluntary groups and organizations, whether they're gardening things or choirs or whatever, all that declines in more unequal countries. People have less to do with each other. Social cohesion declines. And you can also see, again, there are a number of papers demonstrating this on different data for different countries, that people trust each other less. The vertical axis here is whether people agree that most people can be trusted. And you see it varies from about 15 or 20% in the more unequal countries to 60 or perhaps 70% feeling they can trust others in the more equal countries. We did all this work not only on these countries, but we repeated it all on the 50 states of the USA as a separate test bed, wanting to see if the picture was the same in the US as internationally. And it's almost identical. Relationships with inequality on the same sorts of outcomes, very powerful. This is homicide. It's about the best researched of all these outcomes in relation to inequality. It's often called the most powerful influence, environmental influence on levels of violence. These are American states, the red dots. Canadian provinces on the left, bottom left, are the blue triangles. Again, look at the differences in homicide. Homicides per million people. 15 or so in the more equal states and provinces, rising to 150, 10 times as high in the more unequal states. And the reason for that is it seems that where there is issues to do with status, class, and so on that I mentioned early on become more important, people are more touchy about being looked down on, disrespected, humiliation. Those are the things which trigger violence. If I can't make you respect me any other way, I start, it becomes violent. So I think that's what's going on behind this relationship, which people have shown all over the world. If you look at even more unequal countries than we have in the data, Kate and I were asked to give some lectures in Mexico, and I took this picture. You see street after street in which it's gone a whole step further. Mexico is one of the most unequal countries in the world, and people are actually frightened of each other. They don't go out in the evening. Windows and doors barricaded, razor wire around the fence. You see just the same thing in South Africa, which is, again, one of the most unequal societies for quite different reasons. That notice, I'm sorry you can't really read it, it says armed response, so if you're caught climbing in, you might get shot. The parallel lines at the top are an electric fence. So what happens with growing inequality is you lose the community life, the trust, the social cohesion, and people become less trusting of each other, violence grows, less involvement in community life, and then at the extreme you get people being really frightened of each other. We were advised not to go out in these places. And that picture of that loss of community life is really confirmed by the work of two American economists, Bowles and Jayadev, who showed both in this group of countries and in the 50 states of the USA that with more income inequality, you get a higher proportion of the labor force in each country involved in what they called guard labour. Guard labour means police, security staff, prison officers, people like that. So all the people we use to protect ourselves from each other, that becomes a bigger part of the labour force with increasing inequality. And what I think is tragic about it is that if you look at the studies of happiness, the determinants of happiness and well-being, health included, you find that one of the most important things is the quality of social relationships. How many friends people have, whether they're involved in community life. All those kinds of things are powerful protectors of health and determinants of happiness. So what inequality is doing is damaging exactly what's most important to us and our well-being. I think income inequality is not just some sort of new determinant of all these problems. It's telling us more about the class hierarchy. Everyone here knows that if you look at all sorts of outcomes, they're worst in the poorest areas of our cities. Liverpool will have the worst health, the lowest life expectancy in the poorest areas. Probably the kids will do least well at school in those areas. Violence will probably be highest in those areas. And what the graphs I've been showing you, I think, are telling us is that, in a way, the material differences between us, the bigger the material differences, the bigger the social distances between us. Whether we're a very steep society with a very steep social pyramid like that, or a much shallower one. And that changes social relations. And there are lots of things that reflect the increasing divisiveness of class, of inequality, and so on, with more bigger income differences. And even how often people marry someone from a different class origin declines with greater inequality. I want now just to say a few things about mental health, which is really the subject of the second book we've done together, The Inner Level. One of the things we see is that in countries with more inequality, there is more anxiety about status. As I said, class and status become more important, and we're more worried about how we are seen and judged. Do people respect you, look up to you, or do they think you're no good, a failure, and unattractive, boring, and so on? You've got on the vertical axis a measure of status anxiety, and along the bottom you've got all the deciles of the income differences, from the poorest tenth of the population in each country on the left to the richest tenth of the population in each country on the right. The top line is the level of status anxiety across all those income groups in the more unequal societies. The bottom line is the lower levels of status anxiety across all income groups in the more equal societies. So we all become more twitchy about how others see and judge us, more worried about how we're seen and judged, if you like. And we know those kinds of judgments are what make most difference to the biological markers or determinants of the hormones, stress hormone levels. You can measure, for instance, cortisol in saliva or in blood. And there have been hundreds of experiments in psychological laboratories at universities around the world, giving people stressful tasks to do, and then seeing how their cortisol levels respond. And in this review of all that data, they find that the tasks which most reliably push up our stress hormones are tasks which include what they call social evaluative threat, threats to self-esteem or social status, where others can negatively judge your performance. That's a quote from the study. So what really gets to us is those worries about how we're seen and judged. And we know that stress has a direct effect on aging and death rates and so on. This is, along the horizontal axis, a pretty sensitive measure of levels of stress. This data comes from 10 studies where they've followed people through over time, and on the vertical axis, the death rate. So with each step up, increase in stress, you see increased death rates. So basically, stress leads to something that looks like more rapid aging. And when we first started getting interested in stress, I mean, people around the world, I think we thought that probably the most important sources of stress were things like unemployment and losing your job. But, how do I get rid of that? It's not a touch screen. Escape ought to get rid of it.
Ooh, well done. You've switched the whole thing off.
I think I can get it. Yes.
There you go.
So, yes. Clap for my beautiful assistant. We now know, though, that how those things feed into higher levels of a whole range of mental illnesses. A paper in which Sherry Johnson at Berkeley and her colleagues looked at a huge volume of literature on mental illnesses and personality disorders and found that so many of them were triggered by issues to do with status or exacerbated by them. I'm running out of time, so I won't go into that. We had found that actually mental illness was worse in the more unequal countries using some WHO data. But now there has been quite a lot more research showing that mental illnesses are worse in more unequal countries. The length of those blue lines shows the correlation in OECD countries with inequality. So the longer the line is, the more inequality predicts levels of eating disorders, anxiety, schizophrenia, depression, ADHD, and so on. Two things the other way round, suicide and alcoholism, they're not significant like the others are. And I think basically, you can either respond to worries about how you're seen and judged by thinking, you're not good enough, you're not pretty enough, you're not clever enough, and so on. You're boring and unattractive. You withdraw from social life because it's so stressful and become perhaps depressed. And so, for instance, we see depression levels higher in the American states with greater income inequality. But you can also do the opposite. If you're worried about how you're seen and judged, you can become narcissistic. You can flaunt your abilities and achievements, find ways of bringing into the conversation what a wonderful and successful person you are. And of course, we've had some politicians rather like that recently. And I think this is my last slide before handing over to Kate. We can also see not only the depression of people who feel they're not good enough and so on, but also a kind of self-advertisement, self-aggrandizement. The psychologists call it self-enhancement that goes with bigger income differences. Basically, people feeling they're better than other people in their country. So, Kate.
I'm going to get my water. Bring me water.
You want water?
Thank you. I will now probably fail with the technology completely.
She's got smaller fingers, so there's an unfair advantage.
Thank you. Yes, a bit of a switch of tack. I want to talk to you about why inequality is so important for the well-being of the planet as well as people. And it is one of the Sustainable Development Goals to reduce inequality. This is a picture taken in the EU Parliament where a group of us were asked to pick our favourite Sustainable Development Goal. So there's me holding up number 10, which is reduced inequalities. So that's now a goal for the world. You know, all countries are supposed to be striving towards reducing inequality. There are targets and indicators that sit under that goal, and it's there because it's important if we're thinking about sustainability and the shift to having societies that are tackling climate change but are focused more on our well-being than they are on anything else. And there are 6 reasons, we think, why we need more equality, why it's essential to a world that's facing the consequences of overstepping our planetary boundaries and dealing with the climate crisis. And of course, the climate emergency and the degradation of those systems are the biggest threats we face. So in 1972, Henry Wallach, who was a former governor of the US Federal Bank and a professor of economics at Yale, he said growth, so we're talking about economic growth here, growth is a substitute for equality of income. So long as there is growth, there is hope, and that makes large income differentials tolerable. So the idea is that we'll put up with inequality as long as there's that promise of economic growth. But there are planetary limits to economic growth, so we can't behave anymore as if economic growth was a substitute for a more equitable distribution of resources, as he suggested was a way we sort of got fooled into accepting inequality. This chart contrasts growth in GDP, gross domestic product, that's the top blue line from 1950 on the left over to the 2000s on the right, and the flatlining of something that's called the genuine progress indicator. So the genuine progress indicator tries to take out all of the things in GDP that are bad. So you probably all know that gross domestic product goes up if you have an earthquake and a disaster and lots of things have to be done to try and fix it. So the genuine progress indicator tries to take out all of the bad stuff, and that's gone nowhere in the past few decades, although gross domestic product continues to increase. And also we used to be told that we would have to put up with some inequality to get growth, but actually there's no correlation at all within developed countries between income redistribution and growth. So over a number of years in many, many different countries, no correlation at all. And as we get more GDP, we no longer really reap the benefits from it. Here we're looking at GDP per capita across the bottom, so poor countries on the left and the richer countries on the right, and we're looking at life expectancy in years up the side. And so as countries get a little bit richer, life expectancy improves very rapidly until you get to a sort of sweet spot. On this graph at this time, it's where somewhere around, between $10,000, $15,000 per capita. And after that, having more per person doesn't lead to increased life expectancy. And if we just look at that top, we're just going to look now at the top right-hand part of that chart, the rich developed countries, no relationship between life expectancy and gross national income per head. So if you look around about the middle of that graph, Japan is at the top with the highest life expectancy in the world, has about the same gross national income per head as the UK, which is much, much lower. So there are planetary limits to economic growth. We can't keep on pretending that we can just have it forever, and it's not doing much for us anyway. So instead of thinking about progress in those linear terms, more growth, more upward rising trends, we need to start thinking about it with different models. This is Kate Raworth's Donut Economics, which lots of you have probably seen before. And she defines a safe and just space for humanity in between the planetary boundaries around the outside. So, we mustn't keep losing our biodiversity. We mustn't keep polluting our waters. We mustn't keep damaging the climate. But us needing, and this is the inner level, a sort of social foundation. We need everybody to have sufficient water, food. We need everybody to have a reasonable amount of income, access to education, political voice, good jobs, gender equality. So all the social foundations for our well-being need to be there, and we need to not overshoot our planetary boundaries. And within those two, we have a safe and just space where we can have well-being and we can prosper. So the second point I want to make is that the move towards sustainability will probably meet with widespread opposition unless we feel that the burdens of change are shared fairly, that the policies necessary to drive it forward are shared fairly. And we all saw an example of when this didn't happen with the Gilets jaunes protests in France. These were protests against a measure that actually would have been good for the climate, but it wasn't thought through, and it was actually a policy change that imposed too much of a burden on those who have least. It wasn't a fair sharing of the burden, and so we saw those huge protests. Now, we do know that we can get societal civic cooperation for big change if we do it fairly. This is a picture of Richard Titmuss, probably, would you call him the founder of social policy research in the UK?
Academic.
And he wrote about how greater equality underpins societal cooperation during the war, during the Second World War. And he wrote that the government recognized that the cooperation of the masses was essential for the war effort. And so inequalities had to be reduced, and the pyramid of social stratification had to be flattened, just like that picture Richard showed you a few minutes ago. They recognized, it says it twice. They recognized it so much that they did it twice. So this kind of joint cooperation, it's really important if we're going to tackle big problems like climate change, and we're not going to be able to do it unless people feel that this is a fair sharing of what's required. Now, the third reason that greater equality is really important in the fight against climate change and the move to a better structure and economy is that the environmental footprint of the rich is so large that we have to reduce it, not only for the sake of justice, not only for creating all those better outcomes that Richard was talking about, but it's also an essential part of bringing the environmental crisis under control. This is a picture from Oxfam, can't remember which year. Every year Oxfam go to Davos and they do a report and they talk about inequality. This is a few years ago, and their top statistic that year was that just 8 billionaires own the same wealth as the poorest 3.6 billion people. So few that they would fit in that golf buggy. And there are academic studies showing an enormous emissions gap between the top 1% and the poorest. So the top 1% are responsible for the same amount of CO2 emissions in a year as the poorest 10% manage in 2 decades. It would take 26 years for a low earner to produce as much CO2 as the richest do in 1 year. Fourth, consumerism is a huge threat to sustainability. We can't just keep on consuming more and more, but we can't reduce it until we improve equality, because inequality intensifies status competition and increases our desire for personal wealth. So to claw up that social pyramid that Richard said, we buy stuff to show that we're high status, to show that we're important people, to show that we're doing well. We've done a recent study, a review of the relationship between inequality and consumption, concluding that the evidence suggests that income inequality promotes more status consumption as people at each income level try to emulate those above, and that status anxiety is the potential driver of this relationship. And there are studies that show in countries or US states with greater inequality, people do consume more status goods. They do look online for more status products. So the evidence is growing that inequality and overconsumption, status consumption, consumerism are tightly linked. Danny Dorling, geographer at University of Oxford, has a number of slides like this showing more consumption of essential resources with greater inequality. This one's water, but he's also got them for energy, for meat consumption, and other things. The fifth reason greater equality is a really important determinant of health and social well-being, meaning that we must prioritize it over economic growth. That's all the stuff that Richard showed you earlier. The inequality improves everything for us. That's the index graph he showed you. But it's important to know that it's not just us who've done this kind of work. This is a meta-analysis, so that's a study that combines data from lots and lots of other studies showing that income inequality is related to health. So if we want to save the planet and we want our well-being, we need to tackle inequality. As well as our books, we've written about the evidence that these are causal relationships. We've written about whether these are deep psychological pathways, and I wanted to put those up there just in case any of you like reading academic papers. Unlike our students, unlike our families, unlike anybody we know. And then my last point is about greater equality leading people to be more cooperative and mutually supportive, making us more willing to pull together and provide mutual support to one another as we face the challenges in front of us. Richard showed you the link between inequality and civic participation and levels of trust. But we also know that more equal countries perform better on recycling, that in more equal countries, even business leaders are more likely to think that they should comply with international environmental agreements and that their governments should do so too. And we know that CO2 emissions are higher in more unequal countries. One last thing, and I think we were discussing this in the car, I'm not sure we agree about what the pathways are between inequality and changes in biodiversity, but they are there. There is more biodiversity in more equal countries. And I've been working with some colleagues on why that might be so. But certainly the evidence suggests that for reasons to do with equality being related to people having more political power, being able to avoid elite capture of resources, being able to perhaps distribute land more fairly, there is a link between biodiversity and inequality. So just before we take some questions, if you want to know more about the links between inequality and sustainability, we wrote this paper for the Club of Rome, and it's available through them on their website. They've now set up a commission called Earth for All, but it's easy to find if you look online. If you really want to sort of see more about what we're writing, what we're doing, what we've been talking about, we have a website, wilkinsonpickett.com, and everything is there. Everything is up there, so you can listen to podcasts, you can look at what we've been writing about, you can find out more about all of this evidence. These are the two books that Ian kindly mentioned at the start. We're both trying to write new ones now. Richard's doing one on his own, and I'm doing one on my own, and we'll see who finishes first. I don't think it's going to be me. But we are making progress. And if these planetary things and well-being really matters to you, do go and visit the website of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, WEALL it's known as. They've now got 6 governments working together, trying to pursue wellbeing economics, and hopefully being a beacon of change in the world. So I hope that's given you some resources to go and look at if these things interest you. But I think we'll stop now, and hopefully we've got a few minutes for some questions from some of you. So thanks very much.
Done.
Okay, take a few questions. Yes, just here, boy. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much. A very fascinating talk. You've talked about inequality, and I got the impression that it was mainly economic inequality. Have other forms of inequality been included or examined, like between the genders or different parts of society, different religious beliefs, etc.?
Yes. So, this is a model of interacting inequalities that I developed when I was asked to chair the Greater Manchester Independent Inequalities Commission. And I wanted us to have a framework for thinking about how all those different kinds of inequality interact. So what it's trying to show here is that, I've still got my microphone here, haven't I? That there are inequalities that are often by academics labeled as horizontal inequalities. Inequalities that are demographic, if you will, or related to people's identities or the groups they belong to. So we've got age, sex and gender. You could have sexuality there too. Yeah, sexual orientation, disability, race, ethnicity, whether you're a migrant, asylum seeking, the language you speak, etc. So all of those things are related to inequality in our society. But there are also inequalities related to differences between neighborhoods, as Richard said, whether you live in a deprived neighborhood or an affluent one, cities, towns versus coast and country, regions. The north of England has much worse health and other outcomes than the south, and then differences between countries internationally. All of those, what you might think of as horizontal inequalities, get made worse by the vertical inequalities of income, of wealth, of power, of voice. And so you can think about those vertical inequalities as sort of cutting across and pressing down and making all of those others worse as well. So the intersections between them and the way they amplify, it's much worse to live in a more unequal society if you are suffering inequalities relating to these other things than if you're not, but that overall inequality is affecting everybody. So thinking about the intersections and where things meet is really important when you're thinking about policy and what needs to be done and what needs to be changed. So that's the way I think we like to think about it.
Can I just add to that as soon as anything becomes a marker of lower social status, whether it's skin color or religious affiliation or anything else, or language group in some societies, it attracts the same kind of stigma as goes with lower income and poverty and so on. And that, I think, is why all these horizontal inequalities get worse. So women's pay disadvantage worsens when overall income differences in a society get bigger.
Okay, I'll take one more question. There was a chap, yes, with his hand up there, was very keen to ask a question, I noticed at the start. So.
Just for this audience, I was keen to ask whether religiosity is a confounder in your work or in work in this area in general. And then secondly, why aren't people reading your work? And what are you doing about it?
Why aren't people reading
Millions
your
of
work? Talk about your TED talk.
Well, I think we were very lucky to publish just after the financial crash. And I think as a result of that, many people were interested in issues to do with inequality. I've done a couple of TED talks that have been, one of them has been watched by, I think, about 4 million people, and the other by perhaps 1.5–2 million. And our our publisher at Penguin said that it is unprecedented for a serious non-fiction academic book to sell as well as ours did. I don't know where he puts Piketty's, which sold better than we did. Maybe he does. No. So I think there is a lot of interest in it. And of course the public do put it as one of the most important political issues facing us. It's simply that at least we can't get this government to do anything about it. But I think another government might do a little bit. But we need a sustained program of political action and protest and so on. It's not going to be cured by one government in one parliament. It'll need 10 years or so of consistent policies to reduce inequality.
Do you want to put religiosity?
Oh, religiosity, yes. People who have religious belief, studies show that they seem to do better in a number of ways. I suspect that's because they have an all-powerful friend, which is comforting for all of us, but also because they're part of a community, which, as I said, is social contact, social relations are really important. And so to be part of any community, a religious community or any other, is beneficial. However, that's at the individual level. If you take whole societies, the United States is a much more religious society than Britain, for instance. And yet it looks as if health and so on is much less good in that more religious society. And I think it was the anthropologist Malinowski who said people use religion to explain the things that are beyond their control. So, the weather is controlled by the rain gods, hunting by the gods of the forest, and so on.
Which gods control the IT?
Which gods control the IT? Well, there's a man at Google who controls the IT. Anyway.
Okay. Could you show your appreciation, please, to Kate and Richard?